Hi everyone, Maria Samaniego tuning in from Southern California. Congrats on the first ever Digital Inclusion Summit.
Hello everyone, I'm Deb Haaland, Congresswoman for New Mexico's 1st Congressional District. I'm grateful to have the opportunity to share a few words at Hispanic Tech and Telecom Partnership's Digital Inclusion Summit virtually. HTTP's work to advocate for Hispanic communities has had a tremendous impact on telecommunications and technology policy, and I'm proud to support their efforts to make technological advances available to Hispanic and Latino communities everywhere. This pandemic has put a spotlight on the disparities that exist for Hispanic communities and communities of color across the country. Every community deserves access to emergency services and economic relief during this crisis, but as you all know, communities of color have been left behind in infrastructure development, creating connectivity barriers that lead to elders losing access to telehealth services, children being unable to log in for school, and workers being unable to apply for unemployment benefits. I've heard from families in my district and across the country that internet access is too expensive or completely unavailable to them, or that the FCC hasn't taken their right steps to connect everyone, no matter their background or where they live. That's why I introduced the Broadband for All resolution. This resolution affirms that access to broadband internet is a human right and seeks to unleash broadband internet to everyone during these unprecedented times and beyond. But Native Americans living in their communities have not only been left behind in the digital divide, but as sovereign Native nations, they encounter significant barriers to access spectrum rights on their tribal lands, to deploy wireless broadband to their communities. In July, I introduced the Digital Reservations Act, which will help tribes fully realize self-governance and protect their sovereign right to manage their own natural resources on tribal lands and ensure Native communities aren't stuck in the digital divide. Increasing access to broadband for communities will unlock opportunities, and it's a primary focus of mine as we continue to address this pandemic in a state and national scale. I'm your ally in Congress and look forward to hearing about the innovation and ideas that come out of the summit. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Representative Deborah Haaland, for your service in Congress and for your leadership extending broadband infrastructure to rural and tribal communities who are some of the most historically disconnected members of our community. Digital inclusion has been defined in many ways by many people, but to us at HTTP, digital inclusion is about more than just internet access. We see it as a movement towards new solutions that connect every community and every home to affordable broadband. It's an inclusive movement towards information technologies built by and for diverse communities with diverse needs. And it's about ensuring that everyone is able to obtain the digital skills necessary to stay safe online. Hashtag HTTP inclusion means that no one gets left out or left behind, and everyone is connected. To help paint a clearer picture of what true digital inclusion means to diverse communities and what actions are necessary to achieve our shared goal, I sat down with Maria Town, CEO of the American Association of People with Disabilities, John C. Yang, the Executive Director for Asian Americans Advancing Justice, and Marco Davis, CEO of CHCI, the Congressional Hispanic Caucus Institute. Here are some highlights from those conversations.
My name is Maria Town, and I serve as the President and CEO of the American Association of People with Disabilities. Technology has been really central to my life. I will disclose a little bit of my age. I am a millennial, and to talk about the difference that technology can make in the lives of disabled people, I can share a very personal story. So I was born shortly before the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA. And this is the landmark transformational piece of civil rights legislation that prohibits discrimination based on disability status. And so I was born with a disability. It was very clear from the moment I arrived that I would go on to live with a disability for the rest of my life. And, the doctors could have told my parents She won't walk, she won't talk. You probably need to institutionalize her. But instead, they told my parents she probably won't walk, she probably won't talk, but don't worry, there'll be technology. Now, that statement from those physicians set an expectation for my family that I would be able to live in the community, to be educated in a mainstream school, and have a job. Now, admittedly, more than 30 years after the passage of after my birth and 30 years after the passage of the ADA, we see that technology has created great opportunities for people with disabilities, again, to access our communities, to advance our civil rights, but we still have a long way to go. As many opportunities as technology has created for people with disabilities, it has also created new barriers that we don't have as many tools to navigate. I'll give you an example. Transit network companies like Uber and Lyft have said that they don't have to follow the Americans with Disabilities Act because they're not transportation companies, they're technology companies. So there are some major gaps around inclusive tech and what we think of as tech and how it relates to the disability community that AAPD is trying to fill. AAPD is a cross-disability civil rights organization, meaning that we fight to advance the rights of all 61 million people with disabilities across the United States. Disability is an incredibly diverse identity. It includes people like me who were born disabled, those who maybe grow older and age into disability, or potentially someone who has survived COVID and is now living with lifelong chronic fatigue. So just like everyone else, technology plays a instrumental role in the day-to-day lives of people with disabilities. And to be clear, that's if we can afford it and if we can get access to it in the first place. So I really want to emphasize the importance of creating, developing affordable, accessible technology. And if the tech itself isn't affordable outright, creating programs that make it affordable. You know, the FCC already has numerous regulations requiring accessible communications and connectivity, and we want to see further enforcement and enhancement of those regulations. I believe we just celebrated the 10-year anniversary of the 21st Century Communications Act, which is the law that really created a sort of new standard for accessible communications across broadband and was a real win for the disability community. I think one of the things that is a big concern is that there's an enormous digital divide amongst people with disabilities, and a lot of it has to do with the significant poverty that people with disabilities and specifically disabled people of color experience. We want to see broadband expanded to every community with the least barriers to that adoption. So there are a number of programs that folks can sign up for to get either lower rate access or free access, but they're not very well known. And I want to see both federal agencies and organizations like yours and others that focus on broadband adoption to do meaningful engagement with the disability community to figure out, how do we communicate in a way that really hits at what you need and not make any assumptions. When you're thinking about the disability community, we should think about family members and caregivers, but if you want real engagement on these issues and you want to understand how access to broadband is affecting the disability community, make sure that people with disabilities are at the table speaking for ourselves.
As you said, our mission is to advance the civil rights of Asian Americans and to promote a fair and equitable society for all. So what does that mean? That means for us, based in DC, we focus a lot on federal policy with federal lawmakers, as well as some state lawmakers on issues that matter to the community. We litigate. We are part of impact litigation throughout the country, whether it's on issues such as census or voting rights or immigration, to make sure that the Asian voice counts in all of these different circles. Then we are part of narrative change, really making sure that the media understands these stories about the Asian American community. There were other organizations that asked us, well, why are you getting involved in tech and telecom? That seems a little bit askew from quote unquote traditional civil rights issues. And my answer was very easy, which is just as housing is a civil rights issue, just as banking is a civil rights issue, just as employment is a civil rights issue, technology and telecom is the civil rights issue of the 21st century. That embeds in so much of what we do now, whether it is education, whether it is employment, whether it is financial services. So that's sort of the lens in which we decide that we had to be involved in this space. And it is part of our work today. So you talk about some of the big issues that we work on. On one side of the ledger are, if you will, core civil rights issues around facial recognition and what that does to law enforcement, around algorithmic bias and what that does to what our consumers, the Asian American consumers, see or are able to purchase. But then it gets into other core issues of technology and telecom, which goes to broadband access, broadband affordability, and digital literacy. So one of the common myths about Asian Americans is that we are already highly technologically savvy. We are first adopters of technology, and that some of these issues don't matter as much to Asian Americans. And on one level, there's a certain segment of Asian Americans for which that is true. But there's a whole swath of Asian Americans, particularly Vietnamese, Southeast Asian, Filipino, that do not fall into that category. You think about Pacific Islanders and their access to broadband. And in certain parts of the Hawaiian Islands, it is very low. So making sure that we give voice to that entire diversity of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, and when we talk about these issues, has been critical to us. The other place that certainly we share very much common ground with respect to HTTP is around language access. For Asian Americans, about 1/3 of our community are limited English proficient. So if you think about anything related to technology, how it appears on the web, how it appears on your smartphone, and you start thinking to yourself, what does that mean for someone that does not speak English as their first language, or typically would not navigate things in English? What sort of access do they have as we get into this modern society? And so that's another area that we spend a fair bit of time, is to make sure we hone in on those issues and develop some smart solutions there. There shouldn't be that same sort of partisan divide. And we should think about how to deliver real solutions to all of America. Because if, as you were saying, if you're talking about broadband access for rural America, right, that is something that hits on a lot of different segments of the community. And it should be appealing to Republicans. It should be appealing to Democrats. For my community, certainly it appeals to Pacific Islanders. It appeals to farmers working in rural parts of the United States.
I am the son of immigrants, born and raised here in the U.S., and actually grew up in New York. But my father is Jamaican, from Jamaica, West Indies, and my mother is from Mexico, right? And so that's not a usual, typical kind of combination, much less for folks growing up in New York, of all places. But that is really, I think, in some ways central to my whole journey, because from a very early age, from as far back as I can remember, in almost every room I was in, except perhaps with the exception perhaps of a room with my two older sisters as a kid, I was always a little different, right, than everybody else around me. I decided that in my mind, one of the most effective ways to address all of these large systemic issues was to ensure that we had more leaders from our communities who were in positions of influence, who were in place to make decisions, to direct allocations of resources and efforts, et cetera, who would then represent our interests and also, again, try to ensure a fairer playing field and more opportunities for everyone. And so I started working in various different roles and ways to essentially sort of do leadership development to try and help develop both that personal pride and that higher ambition for folks from our communities, but also then to equip them with the tools and the supports and the networks that they needed in order to actually get into and access those leadership roles. Because we realized it was absolutely critical, right? We sort of knew even 3 years ago that it was something that was increasingly a part of everyone's life, was increasingly the ways in which people accessed information, the ways in which people manage some of their lives, and that technology in some ways could provide solutions, as technology often does, and simplify and ease and even increase the benefits that people have in life. But at other times, in some ways, it helps to hold gaps and disparities in place. It serves to maintain barriers and to keep inequities, right? And of course, this year in particular, it's even more crucial than ever because we've seen that it's infinitely more essential to our lives as a result of the pandemic, right? And now it's not just about information. It's not just about media consumption, which is another piece that technology is often raised about, but it's also now things as fundamental as education, right? As far down as kindergarten, right? And it's also health, right? The ways in which people are accessing the explosion of telehealth is a perfect example of the ways in which technology is now even more a part of our lives. Technology is one of the places where there actually could be, and so we want to foster conversations to see if there are best practices already emerging, right? If there are reforms and ideas, if there are new activities that are being that are happening in the technology industry that policymakers could learn from to actually think about crafting policy that ensures that bias isn't inadvertently there, for example, or that security and privacy is maintained, or most fundamentally, right, that access is available, right, so that people can both get onto technology, find affordable ways, or that someone's economic status doesn't actually preclude them from being a part of the digital economy simply by virtue of their economic status.
Hola, mami.
Juan, últimamente mi teléfono funciona donde lo necesito.
Es que te cambié a T-Mobile, que tiene la red 5G más grande del país. Ahora tienes mejor cobertura 5G que nunca.
Ah, me estás diciendo que es importante estar bien cubierto.
Pues claro.
Entonces, ponte un suéter y cúbrete, que te va a dar gripe.
Ay, mamá. Ahora, T-Mobile tiene más torres, más ingenieros y más cobertura que nunca. Ay, mamá.